Welcome to Case in Point, produced by the University of Pennsylvania Law School in collaboration with Bloomberg Law. I'm your host, Steve Barnes. Today we'll be talking about where federal regulatory and rulemaking policies may be headed related to climate change and environmental protection under the new Trump administration. Our guests today are Professor Carey Connolisi, Professor of Law and Professor of Political Science here at Penn, and he's also the Director of the Penn Program on Regulation. His new book is Achieving Regulatory Excellence, out from Brookings Press. We're also joined from Arlington, Virginia by Dean Scott, Senior Reporter for Climate Change at Bloomberg BNA. So let's establish some context, please. How are federal regulations issued and who oversees them, and what exactly are the regulatory or rulemaking powers of the U.S. President?
So regulatory agencies, when we're talking about that, we're talking about entities like the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Transportation, Securities and Exchange Commission. They issue regulations that are binding law. Breaking them is just like breaking a statute passed by Congress. But they issue many, many more binding laws than Congress ever does. Congress may enact 100 statutes in a given year. These agencies are issuing thousands of regulations. Now, how do they get this power? They get this power because Congress has delegated it and specifically authorized them to issue regulations. Now, going into a new administration with this transition, the priorities of these agencies over the last 8 years have reflected the priorities of the Obama administration, which will be different than the incoming administration. So your question is, what could the new administration do about some of the regulations that the Obama administration has issued? It should be clear one thing is that President Trump himself will not be able automatically by the stroke of his pen to revoke or change regulations. They'll only be able to be changed in two ways. One is if Congress steps in and actually revokes some of them. The other is if the agencies themselves take action to revoke regulations. That second strategy will be difficult to do because to revoke a regulation, an agency has to go through the full process that they had to create the rule in the first place, and the decision to revoke a rule will be subject to judicial review, just like the decision to create a new rule in the first place.
That's great. So, Dean, from where you sit, what are you seeing in terms of some of the movement, or I guess it could be considered a little bit of tea leaf reading, about what the incoming Trump administration has in store for regulations related to environmental protection and particularly for climate change?
Well, I think on the climate front, we're expecting basically a complete rollback. I'm looking at a couple options internationally in terms of whether the U.S. stays on the Paris Agreement, which was signed in Paris over a year ago and has entered into force. And we're basically, as reporters, following two tracks on that approach, which is, does Trump simply pull the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement, which President Obama signed us on to without a Senate ratification, largely to get sort of around that sticky issue of most likely the Senate would not have ratified the Paris Agreement? Or does he go after the parent treaty itself to the Paris Agreement, which is a UN Framework Convention signed back in '92? So he could kind of gut the entire apparatus by going after that parent treaty. Internationally, we're looking at that as it's not clear which of those directions he'll go technically, but for sure, we're going to see some action to roll back U.S. commitments internationally. And we're also looking for a rollback of climate change regulations that have been put forth by Obama's under his climate agenda, including the Clean Power Plan, which is the EPA regulatory limits on carbon pollution from power plants. So both domestic and internationally, we expect a fair amount of targeting of these of this climate agenda that Obama put forth.
Great. Putting aside for a moment the international aspects, so let's say the incoming Trump administration does indeed want to roll back environmental protections and climate change efforts. How would that potentially look in concrete or operational terms?
Well, the two actually are connected. So the domestic agenda is how the Obama administration was able to assure the international community that they would be able to meet the obligations they were being made under the Paris Agreement. So they are connected, but you're right, they can be addressed separately too. It's possible that the Trump administration will remain in the international agreements and not touch those, but would still seek to change domestic environmental policy. The Clean Power Plan, which Dean mentioned, it's specifically right now under a court stay. That is, it's been suspended by the courts. It's under review by them. And it's possible for that rule for the new administration simply to come in and tell the courts, basically, we're going to take this back, keep the stay on, or just let's suspend it as we go back and review it and try to settle the litigation as a way of going back and revisiting the rule. But to actually change the rule, and they would have to go through the full notice and comment rulemaking process, and they'd have to build an administrative record that supports rescinding the rule. And that will take, if nothing else, it will take some time. It may also be difficult to sustain ultimately if you recognize that it's been the courts actually that have been driving a lot of the climate change policy under the Clean Air Act. The Supreme Court has basically said to the EPA, you have to regulate climate policy under the Clean Air Act. And the Clean Power Plan has been the central way that the U.S. government has tried to do that.
So, Dean, to you, President-elect Trump has made some interesting picks for his cabinet and for the EPA, for energy, and for the Department of State, in that two of three of them have expressed skepticism about the reality, if you will, of climate change. And what are your thoughts on how that will shape President Trump's environmental protection and climate change agenda?
Well, I think, it seems consistent in a way with some of the tweets and the comments that Trump made prior to the campaign and during the campaign, that he considered this a hoax. It was largely created to benefit China manufacturing and its competitiveness over the U.S. So in a sense, his picks are consistent with that. We're struck a little bit about how extraordinary it is, though, to have, say, an Oklahoma Attorney General that's fought EPA on its Clean Power Plan approach to then be named as the next administrator of EPA. By itself, that isn't particularly worrisome for, I think, the public. The public doesn't sort of follow that issue that closely, the exact rules that are in the climate agenda for Obama. But I think when you take that pick and you add it to this bucket of other picks, including Rex Tillerson from Exxon. Exxon is, some of my sources were saying last week, you could probably pick a Secretary of State even from the oil industry, but Exxon has a particular sort of aura in the world of climate regulations. You'll probably recall that Senate Democrats have been talking for a long time about Exxon's role in allegedly tamping down climate science or introducing doubt into that issue. So you sort of start to take these picks together and you see a theme here, which is we're not just going to be talking about the regulations and whether they go too far or don't go far enough, but we're going to be talking about climate science and how much of this is really justified. And for much of the world, that's sort of a settled issue outside of the U.S., but it's a clear demonstration that at least politically in the United States, climate science is not a settled issue.
Following up on that, Dean, Governor Rick Perry of Texas, it was pointed out in some recent news articles, oversaw some interesting efforts in Texas in terms of renewable energy projects and so forth. So a few writers anyway have said, hold on a moment, there might actually be some interesting work when it comes to environmental protection or sustainable energy efforts by the Trump administration. Which leads me to ask, speaking of what happened in Texas, or what's been going on in Texas, what are you seeing in terms of what governors and mayors are doing in terms of climate change efforts, and how harmonize with or come into conflict what's going on in terms of the federal regulatory environment?
Yeah, I think that's already one of the themes that we're looking at, which is, for energy investors, and particularly in the renewable energy sector, they're still looking at a couple sort of things that are in the foundation of what drives energy policy. And one thing is the states. And there's roughly all over 20 states that have some type of requirement that you have a percentage of renewable energy in your portfolio of what you're generating electricity from. Those don't go away from a change in the administration or in Congress. So there are certain things that are in place that are going to continue to drive wind and solar. And Texas is a great example of that. It's a huge state as far as wind energy. And we still have these production tax credits that were agreed to about a year ago for wind and solar that, as far as we can tell right now, will also carry forward. I'm not sure that they are destined to live on for the next 4 or 5 years for sure at this point, but I think that there are already some Republicans that are saying we're going to let those go. The battle, will be over what to do after those expire. And it's sort of anecdotal, but you do see there are some states that are really on the aggressive side of this climate issue, and Governor Brown from California was quoted last week when he was told about some of the concerns about the science, the NASA satellites possibly being, quote, turned off in terms of their gathering climate data. And he made a comment, something like, well, then California will launch its own satellites. So, I don't know whether we take that seriously as far as states launching their own climate satellites yet, but I think you get a sense of the tenor that there are a lot of states that are on sort of the leading edge of this, and that doesn't go away simply because there's not a cohesive federal policy for a couple years.
Steve, in the same vein, of trying to read the tea leaves, it's notable that the new administration looks to be dominated by business leaders, and there's a strong business case to be made for addressing climate change. And it may well be that despite the symbolic efforts that may take place, and that may include rescinding the Clean Power Plan, but as Dean mentions, there may be other policies that are pursued by this administration and new Congress, the tax credits for renewable energy, for example, that may have a great impact actually in reducing carbon emissions and addressing climate in the new administration. I think we can also see that there's a lot of opportunities in an infrastructure package, and clearly this administration has signaled it wants to invest a lot in infrastructure to address climate issues, to invest in climate resilience efforts, to prepare our nation's cities and coastlines for the changes that climate will be bringing in the years ahead. So there may well be some opportunities for forward momentum, notwithstanding some of the other issues that we've been talking about.
Sure. So President-elect Trump and campaigner Trump talked about day one beginning to slash, quote-unquote, job-killing regulations, needless or job-killing regulations. So you've literally co-authored and co-edited the book on the question of does regulation kill jobs? So my question for you is, does it? What do the data say?
Well, the answer to the question of does regulation kill jobs is both yes and no. Yes, in the sense that it's not hard to look for specific examples of a factory here that might be closing down, or an operation in some individual member of Congress's district. There's enough of those individual stories that make regulation a salient political issue and give rise to politicians saying things like regulations kill jobs. But that said, if you look at the aggregate, you look at the jobs that are maybe killed by regulation and the jobs that are maybe created by regulation, and there are plenty of jobs created by regulations, by the creation of requirements for new technologies that solve problems with market failures. Those jobs actually tend to offset job losses. And so in the aggregate, the answer is no. Really, study after study after study show almost minimal impacts of regulations in terms of reducing jobs and growth. That means that the Republican strategy and the strategy that the Trump administration has announced to try to promote employment by rolling back regulations is unlikely to actually yield much in the way of job gains.
Interesting. Thanks so much. So, Dean, for you, it'd be interesting to hear from you where and how you see the sectors or the areas impacted by potential rollbacks of environmental and climate change regulations, whether that's in coal or oil and gas or in renewable energy.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know that the coal industry is definitely looking for a jolt to get from this administration because of the promises that have been made. I think one of the early battles we're looking for in this next year is both chambers of Congress and the president can, if they sort of work together, eliminate some finalized regulations that don't come through the pipeline until sort of the very end here of this current administration. Thus, they make them sort of vulnerable for a look-back vote under something called the Congressional Review Act. There was a rule, for example, finalized today on stream protection to protect streams and surface waters from coal mining operations out of the Department of Interior. That's a great sort of test case in a way to see if early next year Congress is going to take up that rule and say we're going to have an up or down vote on this Department of Interior stream protection rule. Now, would that provide a lot of jobs if they kill a rule that protects streams? I don't think so. Mostly what's driving the decline in coal in this country has to do with natural gas prices being essentially undercutting coal. There's some regulatory component there as well for coal. But that's a great example of a rule that the Republicans in both chambers and Trump can basically kill and then claim that they're rolling back regulations. But are we going to see several thousand miners employed in the next 4 years for relaxing that regulation? I doubt it, and I don't think anybody has any really good job figures that would back that up.
Mm-hmm. So, Carrie, just one basic question stepping back, whether you're talking about environment or finance or whatever. Do you see just the whole question of regulation being politicized? And will it continue, if so?
Well, regulation's been at the center of political controversy for decades, perhaps throughout the history of the United States, really, or at least this past century. And it's likely to continue. And it very much is a clear talking point of the new administration and Republicans in Congress. I think the question will be what comes out of all of that talk. Will it be some rollbacks of some individual regulations that yield maybe even more symbolic advantages to, say, the Republicans more than actual meaningful changes in employment or other economic conditions? That remains to be seen. I think it's possible to see some fundamental changes in our regulatory process coming forward from the Trump administration. We don't know yet how those will play out. One possibility, President-elect Trump has already indicated that he favors something called a 1 in, 2 out rule, which would be a policy that he could set in his administration that anytime an agency wants to issue a new regulation, they would have to get rid of 2 old ones. We don't know yet exactly how that will be worked out and what the details will be. So it's hard to say whether that will be, again, more of a symbolic gesture or really substantively meaningful. A second avenue to be looking at is what will happen in the Congress. For the last several years, in the House, there have been a number of bills that have been adopted and passed by the House, never cleared through the Senate, but passed through the House that would reform the process and the way that agencies create regulations, creating some more formalities, creating more analytical requirements, greater public notice, and so forth. And in some cases, creating more opportunities for Congress to make changes. So there will be lots of debate over the next several years about regulation. how it rolls out and whether it's truly, as you sort of indicated, a major shift in our structure of the regulatory state will remain to be seen. It will make it very important for the public to pay attention to these issues because at the outset, as I said, federal agencies are creating much more law in America today than even Congress, and how they go about making that law will be a matter of some debate to be sure in the next years.
So climate change is a topic of great debate. There's still some skepticism about it, even though I believe 97% of scientists who study it have consensus that it does in fact exist. But where do you see the debate occurring on climate change, particularly in the GOP and with conservatives?
Well, it's interesting, there's been a sea change within the Republican Party, particularly the Senate. It's the easiest way to sort of track that in terms of looking at a party that at one point during the middle of the Bush administration, John McCain, Senator Warner was a Republican from Virginia, Lieberman, who was independent but a rather moderate Democrat, led efforts to do a cap and trade big climate bill, 2004, 5, 6, in that period. So we've gone from that era where Republicans were often on the sort of front lines of this issue to a very monolithic party in terms of climate science. You can find plenty of Republicans who will say they acknowledge to some degree that humans are having some impact on the climate, but they just disagree about what we should do about that and the cost to our economy. But even there, you look for votes, for example, if you were to hold a vote today on whether the number of Republicans that believe that climate change is so severe a problem that we need to have a national response, that we need to be part of an international agreement, I doubt you'd pick off maybe one or two of those Republicans to sort of side with Democrats who want action. Maybe a Senator Collins from Maine, for example. After that, you find a party that's very much opposed to action on climate change. And this is a very different era from where we were even just 10 years ago. And it sort of speaks to how difficult it will be if you're a company and you're looking for regulatory certainty. Maybe you'd like to be in a position to not have 8 years of a Democrat with a big climate agenda and wondering how you're going to comply with all these things. Then the next era, a Republican president comes in, throws it all out, then we start over. So we're doing these dips and valleys on policy. It's hard to see when Congress is going to step in and just give a clear direction about where the U.S. wants to be on this issue. And that does not look like that's going to be anytime soon.
Climate's always been a difficult environmental issue to have the public mobilize around. It's something very real, but it's abstract. You can't tangibly feel it or see it in the same way that you can smoke from a smokestack or a river catching on fire. The American people have historically very much favored environmental protection. I think the administration is likely to have a little bit more political space, and the new Congress some more political space to roll back some efforts to address climate. There's going to be it's hard pressed to build the momentum to see progress on climate policy going forward in the new administration because of the difficulties of mobilizing around what is, despite its reality, still a bit of a conceptual abstraction. Climate is a global mean temperature, and we don't actually, as human beings, go out the door and actually feel a mean temperature.
Sure, that makes perfect sense. Well, Dean, thank you so much. Carrie, thank you so much. This has been a great discussion, and it will be interesting to see how this plays out in the next couple of years. So thanks to both of you, and we look forward to you, the audience, joining us for the next episode of Case in Point.